Welcome back to the Jimbo Hannon Show. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. The FBI Director, James Comey, has said that the Orlando nightclub shooter, Omar Mateen, has expressed support for a jumble of often conflicting Islamic groups that he had during his call to 911 during the attack, pledged loyalty to ISIS, but also solidarity with the Tsarnaev brothers who carried out the Boston Marathon bombing, also with a suicide bomber who died in another part of the Middle East. And also the government has expressed support in the past for both al-Qaeda and its enemy Hezbollah. And, of course, al-Qaeda and ISIS don't get along either. So you can say that he may have been somewhat confused ideologically, but the general tenor of if they hate America, I'm with them, would certainly seem to be in the forefront. So let's talk a bit about just what the FBI has done and not done in 3 years of interaction with this gunman before he went berserk. With G.M. Cox, he is an assistant professor and the director of the Master of Public Administration program at Tarleton State University. Before that, serving as the police chief for the Murphy, Texas Police Department until July of last year. Before that, police chief for the Corsicana Police Department in Corsicana, Texas, for more than 15 years. So an academic as well as a law enforcement background. Mr. Cox, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here, Jim.
It does seem, certainly, with the hindsight of Monday morning quarterbacking, that the FBI missed some opportunities here. If this person was as radical as we are told, one report even said that during 9/11, that was 15 years ago, when Mateen was in high school, that he cheered during the 9/11 attacks. It's not exactly as though he was hiding himself from the radar. From what the FBI did or did not do, does it appear that they were simply acting under the restrictions of the law, or did they, in fact, blow it?
I think a little bit of both. It's clear that out of 330 million people, this individual's been talked to at least 3 times by the FBI for expressing radicalized ideas. In addition to that, we know that he had been, his wife had reported that he had been domestic violence, and had she reported that and been convicted, he would not have been eligible for a weapon anyway. So there's a number of issues related, but I think the FBI, the very least that they should have done, in my mind, is put a flag on the national background check system so that if this individual tried to buy a weapon, at least a flag would come up and they could go visit with him. Clearly, he purchased these weapons legally.
Yeah.
He went through a background check. So these people that talk about gun control, it's kind of a moot point if the system itself does not, in fact, identify those who shouldn't have them.
Yeah, and in fact, Ed Henson is the owner of the St. Lucie Shooting Center in Orlando, and he says that Mateen passed every background check. We're talking again with G.M. Cox, again, talking about the Orlando massacre, and Brian calls in from Pittsburgh. Good evening, Brian, and welcome.
Yes, good evening. I wanted to make a comment on the Muslim group that was working with the LGBT community to start a push to ban assault weapons. I might be a little cynical, but I think it's ironic that they would want assault weapons banned if they become more and more radicalized and more militant, like a lot of the mosques in the United States are being. They would certainly want assault weapons and gun control in this country. It might make their future plans a little easier for them to attempt to carry out.
Well, assuming that they were, in fact, a part of the group attempting to carry out, and while Brian certainly has a point that there are radicalized Muslims, and for that matter, radicalized mosques in this country. But I would be rather surprised, Mr. Cox, if the ones involved in this get-together, for one thing, even meeting with and agreeing with and working with an LGBT group right off the bat, if you're an Islamic extremist, you don't do that. So I rather doubt that these are the same Muslims.
Well, and that's a good point. There's this idea of what is a radicalized Islamist, what is a radicalized Muslim. That tends to be a moving target depending on what question you ask and who you ask it of. But clearly, there are those out there that might benefit from this self-serving of having a ban on, and if you will, assault weapons. And I would have to tell you, I don't agree with this broad brush that they're being stroked on. They're sport rifles that look like militarized weapons. They are not assault weapons.
No.
Assault weapon, by definition, is fully automatic, has the ability to go fully automatic.
Exactly. And I think that most of the people who come out for a ban on assault weapons probably couldn't have defined one as succinctly as you just did, but that is in fact the case. I mean, but even a semi-automatic weapon is not, by the strictest definition of the term, that is to say one squeeze, one bullet, that is not technically an assault weapon.
It's not, and therein lies another problem.
Yeah.
The horns of the dilemma is, what is an assault weapon by this definition? So would a .22 semi-automatic rifle become banned under the system? So it tends to be an overly broad application, and when you start banning one, you now have implications further down the line. And that's, I think, the problem with gun owners is, where do you stop?
Exactly. Where do you stop? You need some precise definition, and they're few and far between. I would add one thing as we go to another call here, and that would be that it is often fairly simple. Once you have a semi-automatic weapon, it's often, not always, but often fairly simple to machine that device to turn it into an automatic weapon. To Helene in Inglewood, Florida now. Good evening on the Jim Bohannon Show.
I'll be brief because I know you guys are going to be busy. I understand that the shooter was fired from 2 jobs. So I'm having a hard time understanding how he was hired by a national security company, and why, simply because he was working for a security company, the background checks were minimal simply because he was a security guard.
I think those are very good questions. Obviously, the standards for security guards are, shall we say, less than stellar, number one. And number two, we've heard all these things, of course, about his radical viewpoints. You tell me, Mr. Cox, my guess would be that getting a security job would be based on no small part on whether you have convictions on your record, and not at all on whether or not you have radical viewpoints. In other words, let's say you're a dyed-in-the-wool Klansman, but you've never been convicted of anything. My guess is that you could be hired as a security guard.
Yes, and if you're a really good liar, it would be very easy. Within the radical Islamic ideology is this idea of kitman and taqiyya, which is the ability to lie about my true identity and efforts, and I can use deception. So if you ask a radical Islamist if he's a radical Islamist, he can actually tell you to your face and lie and say, no, I'm not a radical Islamist. Look at me. I'll go out here and drink alcohol with you. We found this out in 9/11 in the commission report of the post investigation. So this is quite part of the radical Islamist toolbox, is this idea of not only deception, but using lies to support their position and lead you to believe that they're something other than they really are. Now, whether this shooter is that kind of guy, whether he's that sophisticated, another issue. But I would tell you, I think the security company is going to have some questions pointed at it. How could this individual possibly pass a background check? You obviously didn't check far enough into his radicalized comments. I mean, he spoke ill of people in the office place. He would make derogatory statements toward people. This is unacceptable behavior in an American workplace.
So we need standards on who gets hired as a security guard. Yeah, I would thoroughly concur that we do. Now, as for what the FBI did not do, again, you suspect that it may have been partially that the law did not allow the FBI to do a lot of things preemptorily or preventatively. Would you change the law? I mean, are we in the situation now where we need to give the authorities preventive detention? This guy is a weirdo. He's a whack job.
Right.
I mean, is that going to be the basis for locking people up now?
I don't think we have that yet. I think the USA Patriot Act gives the FBI and other domestic intelligence and law enforcement agencies the authority they need. Now, I will say that some of the USA Patriot Act has expired. Some of it needs to be renewed. Other aspects of data analysis, data mining needs to be brought back in so that NSA and other agencies can create these algorithms. But in this case, we have boots on the ground intelligence. We have an FBI agent or more than one visiting with this individual eye to eye. We know that he had at least 3 incidents where his radical Islamist ideals had risen to the level of coming to the FBI's attention. I think at that point, the FBI is certainly justified in putting a flag on a purchase for a background check on weapons. But at the very least, I think we also know that the FBI it's a tough job balancing freedom of speech, the right to associate with other people, and balancing that Constitution with that probable cause requirement that before you can take legal action or law enforcement action against an individual.
Yeah. In terms of what we do now, obviously people want to do something. Is susceptibility to this kind of attack simply the price we pay for living in a free society?
I think there's a certain degree of that, yes, but I think we can do something about that. It's policing a free democratic society is the toughest police work on the planet. If you want to see some examples, go to some of these dictatorial oligarchy countries where you have police officers can do whatever they want, whenever they want. There's no judicial review. There's no legalistic approach. It's simply control. That is not what we have in America. We have standards. We have rule books. We have codes of criminal procedures. So these officers and these FBI agents have to follow the law. Criminals don't. Criminals can play. They don't have handbooks, and they can do whatever they want. And only if they get caught do we hold them to that standard. But there are things we can do. Number one is we can acknowledge the fact that we are responsible for our own safety. So what are we doing to help ourselves? Are we prepared? Have we had a plan? There's a couple of training videos on the web called Run, Hide, Fight. I highly recommend that people look at those and be prepared. If you're going to a place, have a little bit of situational awareness. Look, where are the exits? If I had to run, where would I go?
Was there evidence, as far as we know, that people violated those rules? Now, you did have, of course, a crowded nightclub, some 300 people in it. I'm not sure how many exits they had, but clearly, with that many people, if you used every exit and you acted very rationally and in compliance with and full knowledge of all that was available, it would take you a while to empty any building of 300 people.
Absolutely. And that's another one of the threats. You have to ask yourself, how willing am I to be put into a place that has 300 people, and if I had to run, there would certainly be a panic response, and quite frankly, I could be trampled to death. That's an assessment. If you're willing to live with that kind of risk, then go forth and do it. I happen to believe that the worst thing we can do is lock down our society and do what these terrorists want us to do. And instead, what we are to do is like the Israelis do, and they live life to the fullest. When a terrorist attacks in Israel, they have a unit that comes out, cleans up, and they restore that neighborhood, that building, whatever it is, to as good a condition as it can, and they go on with life. They are not going to let terrorists dictate to them how they live their lives.
And that's important that we do, in fact, do that. Now, if we have somebody like an Omar Mateen who just screams to the world, "I hate America," and you could not do anything more than wear a T-shirt saying, future terrorist across the front. What do you do with a person like that? Again, in a free society with guarantees, protections, Miranda rights, and the whole nine yards. Got about 20 seconds.
Well, number one, you can't do anything with this guy, but I would certainly be watching him. If he's walking at me wearing that shirt, I'm going to watch him. So this person deserves. He's an American. This guy was born in America. He's had all the benefits of a good country. And he still was radicalized. So keep in mind that this radicalization process is not just about economics.
Fair enough. Stay on the line. We'll speak briefly off air. Again, G.M. Cox, from Tarleton State University. Back in a moment.